everyone for joining us this afternoon. To me, this is one of the most exciting parts of the discussion because what we're really talking about here is how do we align these programs, recognizing there's more than LCCs out there working on large landscape, other organizations and agencies that have been thinking about and doing large landscape conservation for some time, other programs that are just starting. And we need to really think about, and what was exciting to me about the earlier panel's discussion was that we're really talking about is how do we integrate and how do we align these programs. So we can learn a lot from this morning's discussion about content and about subject matter and methodology and the science that needs to get done. But I think a lot of us who work, particularly in government, but in any of these organizations or partnerships, understand that some of the real limitation is in how we integrate across these jurisdictional and organizational and political or geographical boundaries. And thinking about the complexity that we have in the Great Northern, including international boundary with Canada. So the Gretzky slide always goes over well with them. And also, you know, multiple states, multiple tribal organizations and entities, multiple non-government organizations doing a lot of great science and conservation, as well as, of course, multiple federal agencies and jurisdictions. It's very complex. And so the real question becomes, how do we fit these things together? Which ones are the relevant ones to fit together? And today we're just going to hear from a few, recognizing this is not the full smorgasbord of programs that are out there. But we did pick a few. And so the way this is going to be laid out is that we have 4 speakers. They're each going to talk about a different federal or non-federal, sometimes, I'm trying to think, we do have federal and non-federal state NGO-driven programs. And they're going to talk about sort of a different perspective on those and how that might get at the landscape conservation issue and how that fits in with LCCs. And then afterwards, we're going to have 3 breakout sessions. So one will be on the Collaborative Forest Land Restoration Program, the U.S. Forest Service program. One will be on the joint venture and the National Fish Habitat Action program. And one will be on sage grouse. And so you can choose which of those breakout sessions you want to participate in. And what we'll do is we'll have some group Q&A here, assuming we have time. And then whatever other questions we have, we can take into those more specific discussions where there will be additional presentations in some cases, and some cases it's a panel discussion. So that's the layout. So our panelists today, I'm going to let them introduce themselves or give their own background. We felt like that would be the best way to approach this, to give them the most time. We're going to start with Ann Carlson of the Wilderness Society. Ann's located in Bozeman, Montana, and is the Northern Rockies Climate Adaptation Coordinator. And she can give you a little more background on what she does.
Thanks so much, Yvette. I'll just say very briefly that I work on issues related to climate change in the Northern Rockies through a combination of collaborative landscape-level adaptation projects as well as intensive educational outreach programs to Montanans about the regional impacts of climate change and what it means for them in their everyday lives, as well as what kinds of activities they can undertake, both as communities and as individuals, to start to address it on the ground. So it's a real honor for me to have the opportunity to talk with you today about the many ways in which LCCs can add value to large landscape management projects. Oh. Let's see, while it's coming up, I'll see if I can remember. So I'm going to do this by providing a very specific case study today about how this has really brought a tremendous amount of value to us, and so I'll be giving you a partner perspective. And I'll be doing that through the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, which I'll refer to as CFLRP, in the southwestern crown of the continent. And so over the course of the next 6 slides, I'll just give you a very brief introduction to the CFLRP Act and the intent, as well as the specific project that we're undertaking in the southwestern crown of the project. Then I'll talk a little bit about just one very specific set of challenges we're facing on that project with regard to the need to manage and monitor aquatic systems at the watershed scale. And then talk about how the LCCs have really added a tremendous amount of value for us and helped us to successfully address some of these challenges. Okay, so the Forest Landscape Restoration Act was introduced to Congress by Senator Bingaman and subsequently passed in 2009. And so this is a new federal program that aimed to create a new model of community forestry on our public lands, specifically on Forest Service lands. And when I say community, I mean a very diverse group of people working in collaboration and having input into this process, including citizen groups and NGOs, local stakeholders and businesses, universities, tribes, and so on. There are a number of main goals for this particular act. I'll summarize a couple of the most important ones. One is to reduce fuels in the wildland-urban interface. And by that, I mean in areas where you have had ingrowth of small diameter trees over the years that now have created very unnaturally high fuel loads near rural communities. The idea is to go in and thin those out so that you're reducing the risk of catastrophic wildfire in these rural communities. These small diameter saw logs are then supposed to be sent to local timber mills to provide steady amounts of material for them to use and to help them stay in business. And then lastly, there is a very strong encouragement in the Act for the Forest Service to use prescribed fire to get fire back on the land after many decades of policies of fire suppression. So fire, as you all know, is an incredibly important part of the ecology of these forests. In this way, this socioeconomic and ecological model aims to create jobs and improve economies in rural communities, as well as increase the resilience of forests and watersheds. And there's also a real emphasis on restoring and sustaining old-growth forests, controlling and hopefully eradicating invasive species, both aquatic invasive species and noxious weeds. And lastly, adaptive management of forests on our public lands. And so there's not only a need to develop and implement large-scale monitoring programs to inventory these current resource conditions, but also to understand the impacts of these large-scale restoration activities over the course of 10 years for each of these projects, so that that can inform future management actions and strategies. So as soon as, literally within hours of this act being passed and announced, there were a group of collaborators in the Crown of the Continent who thought they would just sit down and explore the possibility of trying to really expand their collaborative so that they could try and do this. And so the Crown of the Continent is about a 12 million acre landscape that's in northwestern Montana and then southern Alberta and British Columbia. And on the Montana side, which you can see in the map at the bottom, that encompasses a number of different areas, including Glacier National Park and the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex and the Rocky Mountain Front, for example. And so these collaborators sat down, decided that they wanted to do this, and started working up a large landscape plan and a proposal. And they were lucky enough to be selected as one of the original 10 CFLRP projects in 2010. And so this program, this federal program, like the LCC program, is also very young. So you can see the shapefile in the southwestern Crown of the Continent for this particular project. It goes across 1.5 million acres on parts of 3 different national forests that are often very ecologically distinct from one another. I'm not going to read all of these. I'll just put them up so you can get an idea of the scale of the work that we're proposing to carry out over the course of a decade. But you'll see that there's really an enormous amount of money and restoration effort and jobs that go into this. I'd like you to focus on the last line, which talks about the need to really identify for the Forest Service roads that are either unnecessary or are having very significant negative impacts on watersheds and fisheries. There's a real emphasis on road right-sizing within the Forest Service, and so this is one of the things that the Act really strongly encourages everyone to work on very actively, as well as water. We live in the West. Water is incredibly precious, and in Montana, we live in a semi-arid state. And so this is something that huge numbers of people think about and work on every single day. And so the need to really come up with a way to manage aquatic systems carefully and in new ways across large landscapes was a very key need for this project. And so I've put up a map that just shows you one watershed within the southwestern crown. And so hopefully you can see that there are very faint little green lines all over it. Those are all streams or rivers. I have not laid the road system over that, but if I did, you would see that there are an enormous number of roads as well. And so this highlights two major challenges for a federal program like this. One is, how do you actually identify and prioritize the roads that you would like to remove first? How do you figure out which ones are having the most negative impacts? And the second challenge is really highlighted by all those colors that you can see. Each one of those colors represents either a different set of restoration activities that are large scale or combinations of them. So once you get done doing all of these things, how do you determine through monitoring protocols if you've actually made things better, if you succeeded in achieving the objectives for those restoration projects? This is the only way we can accelerate learning for the management of on large landscapes, and so it's really critically important. There are also other reasons why this is enormously challenging. There's a tremendous amount of natural variability in climatic, biophysical, and disturbance-driven landscape characteristics. There are complications of measurement error, as in any on-the-ground work. High costs of data collection are coupled with limited funding for the CFLR projects. And lastly, the influence of roads on watersheds, processes, and stream habitats remains controversial and poorly understood. And this is exacerbated by the fact that where we do have broad-based empirical models, they may not be relevant across different kinds of geologies, for example, the belt geologies of the Crown. Okay, so how does partnering with the LCC add value? In a lot of ways. I won't touch on all of them today, I'll just summarize them. We were fortunate enough to receive a 2011 grant from the Great Northern LCC to develop and test methods for establishing the impacts of the Forest Service roads on streams and lakes, and to evaluate the effectiveness of these large-scale restoration projects through monitoring protocols. This allowed us to leverage funding between federal programs, so between the CFLR program and the LCC program. The way that the CFLR Act is written, there's a requirement for a one-to-one match for every single monitoring dollar to be released. So for example, that this year, that's $400,000 that has to be raised externally to allow us to get all of that money released that's set aside for monitoring work in the CFLR project. Also, all of the NGOs who sit at the table do so because they're able to successfully fundraise and fund their own time to be there. And we have found that there are a number of private foundations who are deeply interested in having this kind of a match between private and public funding. This also allowed us to leverage collaboration across multiple agencies and NGOs and universities across the West to develop this new model for the management of aquatic systems at a watershed scale. And so we now have identified some of the best and the brightest in the Forest Service and the USGS in particular, and have folks from those agencies from as far away as Utah coming and participating in our work to try and address these challenges together. And so we've all been talking quite a lot today, I'll just touch on it, about how important LCCs are in developing these kinds of tools and models and data sets that link science with management. And it also provides, across a much larger region than we would normally have access to, opportunities for networking and learning about other people's work and tools and data, and sharing of the models that we're developing within our collaborative. and allows us to also participate in some of the conversations about how you do large landscape conservation in general. And so I just want to touch very briefly on a couple of other important tools in science. One is that we're now able as well to use, we're aware of, which we probably wouldn't have been, or maybe wouldn't have been, other tools in science that are available that have also been funded by the GNLCC grants in 2011. And so, for example, in order to try and address climate change at a watershed scale much more effectively, we're using one of the sets of products that have been developed about stream flow and stream temperature models and data sets, which will allow us to really address the needs and current habitat use by native trout fisheries. There's also the Landscape Conservation Management and Analysis portal that we'll be using through the GNLCC. And as many of you know, there's a very huge need to figure out how to deal with your data cataloging and repository needs and data sharing. The CFLR project requires that we share all of these data with the public, and so you have to figure out where to store them and how to do that. And so we're able to do that as well through the GNLCC. And that allows us to also export the data to our project website. And these things are free, which is great because we spend a lot of time raising money, and if we didn't have access to these kinds of tools and support, we would have to really devote an enormous amount of time to try to find another way to fill this need. And so I'm going to stop there, but I just wanted to say that it's a very young program. We think it has a tremendous amount of potential. It has had so much value for our particular collaborative and in our region, and so we're very excited to see how this may play out in coming years. And lastly, I just wanted to thank all of our partners in the collaborative. It's a real honor to be able to sit at the table with such exceptional people to try and work on these kinds of projects together. Thank you so much.
And Anne didn't give too much of the history or the administrative background of CFLRP, but we do have some Forest Service folks here that can help answer some of those questions. There's quite a bit of money that's been legislated, and it also has a huge partner component to it that includes non-federal partners, and so that's why Anne is involved. And so it really is a great collaborative opportunity for LCCs if there's a CFLR project in your LCC area. Our next speaker is Paul Schmidt, a long-term veteran of the Fish and Wildlife Service, but now actually works for Ducks Unlimited as their Chief Conservation Officer. And he's going to be talking about the joint venture programs, the migratory bird and bird waterfowl programs that have been, for the last 20 years or more, been working on a landscape scale on partnership and collaborative landscape conservation. Go ahead, Paul. You can introduce yourself.
That was enough of an introduction, because I'm told by my friend Mike Millard I have exactly 10 minutes, but that's by my watch, Mike. Yeah, I did serve with the Fish and Wildlife Service for 33 years, then had a change in career and moved to Ducks Unlimited in our headquarters office last May, so not even a year into it. I know that joint ventures are well known, particularly in this audience, but when I looked through those attending, I thought I at least needed to touch on a bit of history before getting to some closing remarks. Craig and Mike called me in a weak moment a couple of months ago. I was on travel, actually in New York City, and they knew the weakness that I have, two weaknesses. One is a real passion for joint ventures and a hope for landscape conservation cooperatives. And the other is I can't say no, and so they had me when they got me on the phone, and I said yes. Credit goes to a number of folks. I stole some slides. I got to give credit where it's due to Guy Fawkes and some of my friends in the Fish and Wildlife Service who provided some of these slides. So I'm going to give you a quick, but I think rich history of joint ventures and why it's important for us to think about that history and as a model for going forward and to figure out how that relationship will go forward in this new age of landscape conservation cooperatives. So briefly, 1986, lots of concern about waterfowl populations. A continental plan was developed, very inspirational. Some people, such as Gary Myers in this audience, can tell you about the origins of that. But very important to the overall foundation to joint ventures. And so we saw some serious problems and wanted to restore populations to those levels. And how do you do that? You do that together. A number of populations were adopted or considered in that plan. All waterfowl habitats were identified that were important and conservation actions planned out. Objectives, both from population standpoint and habitat standpoint, were developed. But most important and relevant to this crowd is that the notion of joint ventures was founded in those early days. That this was going to be something that was such a huge lift that it would take all the organizations working together, bringing their agendas, as was mentioned earlier today, but building a better mousetrap together. And so they were formed was a public and private partnerships that would try to deal with North American populations on a continental scale. But dealing with those most essential habitats, those priority habitats, in a refined fashion. But the first thing that folks a lot smarter than me thought of is that we've got to have a bit of a structure to it. While these joint ventures were originally and continue to this day very organic in nature, I think someone mentioned it earlier today, there needed to be something that would bridge them and integrate them together so they were pulling in the same direction. And so structure was created. Briefly go through that, but there was a Continental Plan Committee. It was made up of agency folks who have as their fundamental and legal responsibilities to worry about these populations. But then these organization or these organically driven partnerships were formed, connected to other structures that include state organizations, very important to waterfowl and conservation in general. And then last but not least, and least in this slide, is a need for science to drive all of this. And so this is a model that many people are proud of, that has both a regional, or all regional, national, and international components to it at all those scales. And now come the maps that show the evolution, the organic evolution, focused mostly on waterfowl, or entirely on waterfowl in 1986, and just a handful, 6 initial joint ventures focused on those priority habitats. But as the plan was updated and the needs were more fully understood, additional joint ventures, again, organically formed out on the landscape where partners saw a need for action. And so in 1994, a number of other joint ventures were created, continuing that same model in 1998. And I will mention here briefly that during the 90s, other bird initiatives came to the forefront. Partners in Flight, land birds, water birds, shorebirds, all began to form and look at this as an opportunity to rally around what was originally only a waterfowl idea. 2002, additional joint ventures on the update were created. And finally, to the map today, which has very little white spots, no space not touched by a joint venture, essentially, a little spot in California, I'm not sure why. But other than little spot in California, the entire continent basically is covered by a joint venture. I focus only on the United States here for obvious reasons. So a joint venture, a unique set of partners who have taken a set of migratory bird objectives to apply to specific geographic regions in North America. And so here, at this point in time, while it did start occurring in the 90s, the notion of all bird joint ventures became a reality. They also got tapped with in memory of Charles Baxter. The quote at the beginning was what, to me, captures what joint ventures are all about and what I think essentially LCCs can take as well. And that is regionally based, scientifically driven, landscape-oriented partnerships. One important point to not miss in all of this is that throughout this evolution, measurable objectives have always been at the forefront. In other words, we want to be able to measure success, as I think Secretary Hayes said earlier today. We want to be able to measure and demonstrate success. So in order to do that, you've got to measure things. Populations, at least in the case of birds, quite easy, or easier than most, to measure and demonstrate success. Joint ventures criteria was responsible for coordinating the delivery of national and international conservation plans. And while it began with the waterfowl plan, as I mentioned, Partners in Flight or land birds created a plan modeled after that one. Shorebirds and then water birds all become the fundamental guiding post for these joint ventures. They are directed by a diverse management board representing the full community concerned about these particular species. So let's just take one real quick example in the prairie potholes, and some of this is going to look familiar. When you see who makes up the organizations that make up the management board that drives the prairie pothole joint venture. So you've got a number of states that worry about these critters. You clearly have a number of non-governmental organizations, including Ducks Unlimited, who worry about these critters. And then, of course, you've got the federal agencies that are key partners in all of this. So you could replace these sets of organizations with your own in terms of LCCs and where you're headed. Probably the list is longer, I wouldn't doubt. But you can see some of the similarities to today. And these all are guided by implementation plans, and the decision bodies are the management boards that guide them. This is going to look familiar to most of you as well, working at various scales, beginning with the continental scale, regional scale, and then, of course, action on the local scale. So capacity. It's one thing to say you'll be the joint venture, it's another to generate the capacity to do it. Again, one of the criteria. Much of the funding actually comes from the Fish and Wildlife Service, at least the original monies that sort of seed the partnership, but eventually partners bring in additional resources to that table to do the various activities that joint ventures have been doing for the past 25 years. Biological planning, conservation design, prioritization, project development implementation, very proud and rich history there. Monitoring, evaluation, and applied research, absolutely critical to not only joint ventures, but clearly to LCCs. Communication and outreach, fundraising for specific projects, and reaching other sources of funding to actually do the projects that change the landscape. Run through this really quickly because this is just an example, a typical maybe joint venture and staffing that exists. Not that this is something that you all at LCCs need to focus on, but just to know there are expertise in all of these joint ventures that can be called upon to help the LCCs and vice versa, hence the original title of my presentation, Coexist or Complement. Project examples, habitat conservation, research, coordination, and analysis and policy, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that under LCCs in just a minute. I'm going to close it out because I see Mike Millard getting very nervous in the front row with some closing remarks. And these are just my thoughts, and take them for what they're worth, but I think important at least to consider, and hopefully we can talk about these in one of the breakout sessions this afternoon. JVs do have a rich history to be respected, but to be built upon in terms of landscape conservation cooperatives. I think, and this is my term, it's good government. It's a good government model that can be improved upon, and hopefully that's the direction that LCCs are headed. Responsibilities grew as the evolution of joint ventures grew, both in terms of the geographic coverage, but also in terms of the species. It wasn't necessarily planned out particularly well, but organic in nature, and I think actually was quite successful. There was a real scrap for resources early and often throughout that whole process, something that frankly, we don't see $100 million come. It never came to the joint ventures to get them started, like David Hayes mentioned today. The joint ventures would have been envious of that throughout this. Unfortunately, during that time period, resources did not keep pace with the responsibilities in the job. At one point, just a few years before the advent of LCCs, JVs began to think about how we could grow beyond just birds and how that would happen. It was a conscious decision and dialogue, and it never progressed to actual on-the-ground decisions that would have embraced additional resources or additional species. But it's certainly timely that the LCCs come to pass and do worry about all species. Hopefully, some of this has helped us learn and adapt for the future. As mentioned this morning or early this afternoon, it's an opportunity to really demonstrate leadership with landscape conservation cooperatives. This is something we cannot overemphasize. There are folks who are watching for duplication and inefficiencies in this organization, in this enterprise. You can just go back to the subcommittee and the Committee on Appropriations in the House last year. And if you haven't read that, you ought to, because it is a serious message to this community to take note that we should do everything we can to demonstrate efficiencies and not have duplication in effort. And they don't want to see the fish habitat partnerships and the joint ventures, LCCs, just kind of running around inefficiently and duplicating efforts. So it's got to be complementary, particularly on that science element. In my mind, LCCs need to really focus on that landscape change. That's something that we haven't done a good job of in joint ventures particularly, or in the plan. It's something that's got to be helpful to all of the initiative plans that you'll hear about this afternoon, and to understand what are the impacts of our conservation treatments. Emphasize the need for acquiring information that will affect land use policies. Very, very critical. Again, policies on that first note is just a reiteration of the need to inform things like the Farm Bill. How will we approach that big policy decision that's about to happen? We need to approach it together with LCCs. Although each of us think we're unique in our place in the landscape, connecting us together is critical, and that's why it's important to bring this kind of workshop together. Coordination internationally is absolutely fundamental. It is to birds, and I think it is to most any of the other species that we worry about, particularly the habitats. Continental. And here's the final slide, going from where we were to where I think we ought to be. Initially, when LCCs came on the landscape 3 or 4 years ago, I was with Sam Hamilton when those ideas were being fleshed out. There was lots of confusion, lots of concern. I could have put concern. By the way, this is my 4 Cs. If you remember Gail Norton, she had her 4 Cs. These are my, in fact, when she did that, I thought she was looking at my freshman year report card. But we go from confusion at the beginning to competition. Oh, are the joint ventures going to survive through this? Let's worry about our piece. Let's compete for those very few dollars that are available, to hopefully at least making it to coexistence, but ultimately to complement one another's work. It's the only way we're going to make this happen. Thank you for your patience with maybe more than 10 minutes, Mike Millard.
Thanks, Paul. And I think Paul did not mention this, but part of the reason we asked Paul to speak about joint ventures is that in the House language that funded LCCs was specifically called out on how LCCs would coordinate with joint ventures and also the National Fish Habitat Action Plan, which Scott is going to come up and talk about in a second, as well as USGS cooperative units that work out of universities and some other programs. And so Congress is asking us to think seriously about how these programs can be integrated, at the same time recognizing the value that we do have to start to work together and giving us the time to do that. So it's good that we're here and have so much energy and think power on this. So thank you, Paul, for that. And with that, Scott's going to come up. Scott comes from a state background in Georgia and Texas, but is now the coordinator of the Southeast Aquatic Resources Partnership, and will give a specific example of the National Fish Habitat Action Plan, how it's being enacted in the Southeast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me and giving me the opportunity to speak here. Mike, I'm afraid I'm not going to help you out because, you know, we don't talk fast in Georgia. So I am from Georgia. I've been there for about 17 years now. I worked for 10 years or so there for the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, and then took on this job as a SARP coordinator. It's been a great experience, and I want to tell you a little bit about what we do. So what landscape conservation looks like for fish, and then I'm sure you'll see some opportunities for LCCs and some of the opportunities that I see there. I do have some skin in the game. I work on 4 LCCs currently, serve on 2 partnership advisory committees, the South Atlantic and the Gulf Coastal Plain and Ozarks, steering committee for the Gulf Coast Prairies, and then my steering committee chair, Bill Reeves, represents us on the Appalachian LCC. So we've been in this game from the start, and we're here to stay. See if I can figure this out. There we go. A little bit about SARP. We started in the Southeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Gary Myers probably helped get us started there. We were modeled after the joint ventures, so I think this is a great follow-up to Paul's presentation. We were really trying to bring the joint venture concept to fisheries conservation. Gary used to say, why can't we do for fish what we do for ducks? Well, why can't we? So that's where we're going with it. Steering committee of SARP, you can see, and the geography there. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Some of the partners that we work with, this is just a sampling, but just to give you some idea of how we function and some of the folks that we work with. Some of the things that we do are going to look pretty similar to what joint ventures do, conservation planning. We really work hard at facilitating local projects that help address regional and national priorities. So we spend a lot of time and effort on that. And then some of the ways that we do outreach and training of both communities where we put habitat projects on the ground, as well as in-reach, I guess you'd call it, to some of our agency staff. We have a strategic plan. I think that's a requirement to be a partnership. And so this is the Southeast Aquatic Habitat Plan, some of the key elements of that. We look at healthy watersheds, functional riparian areas, natural flow regimes are important to us, natural fluvial processes, and some of the things that you see that are going to be familiar there. We're part of the National Fish Habitat Action Plan. We have been from the start of that. It's now the National Fish Habitat Partnership, I believe. But we were one of the original fish habitat partnerships recognized by the board about 5 years ago. So I wanted to put a plug in here for the National Fish Habitat Assessment. I didn't play much of a role at all in developing this. I think some of the folks that did are here, maybe Gary Whelan and Doug Beard. But this was a national science and data team that's put together this national assessment of fish habitats, really looking at landscape metrics. What you'll find is we don't have a lot of the in-stream metrics on a national scale or even a regional scale, but we know that these landscape and land use metrics actually affect fish habitat and in-stream conditions. And so that was the premise that this assessment was built on. Here's the map of the lower 48 rivers and streams assessment. So you can see some of it's basically threats to fish habitat. Now the regional habitat assessment that SARP works on is complementary, but it also gives us greater information, more specific information on a regional scale and on a smaller scale. We look at specific things like species of greatest conservation need. One of the things we've looked at is riparian areas, condition of those, and I want to talk about that just a little bit. We looked at the percentage of disturbed land cover in riparian areas. Looking at that across this region, when you compare that to the national assessment, you see a lot of similarities there. Probably also a lot of similarities to any type of landscape disturbance that you might look at. Now, riparian areas to me are the perfect area where all of us can work together. They're important to wildlife, they're important to fish, they're important to the health of our streams. Perfect place for us to work together. So let's think about that as we move forward on this. We have quantitative targets, as Paul mentioned. Those are absolutely critical. These were very difficult for us to develop on a regional scale. The data just wasn't available relative to fish habitat. So this is a place where I think the LCCs could play a good role in helping us develop some common quantitative targets for conservation across the region. You can see we developed these 5 years ago, and we had goals for 2012 this year. So it's time for us to revise these goals. I think it's going to be, I think we would be falling down on the job if these targets did not contribute to the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. So they need to be hand in hand. A little bit about aquatic habitat connectivity. This is another area where we don't see a lot of regional information. This is a study that's going on in the Carolinas that American Rivers and NOAA has funded. Probably the most comprehensive in the region that we've seen across a large scale like this, across 2 states. But certainly there's nothing like this across the Southeast region or the nation that I'm aware of. Habitat connectivity, both lateral, connectivity with floodplains, and connectivity longitudinally so animals can move up and down streams and rivers is very important. This is just an idea of some of the studies. The Forest Service has done some great work on their watersheds. So we identified these are places where we know what connectivity looks like across the region. We've got the Carolinas, we've got the Forest Service properties, and then some strategic habitat units that the Fish and Wildlife Service is working on in the Mobile River Basin. These are the places where we know the most about connectivity aquatic habitat connectivity on a broad scale. So there's lots of room for improvement there on the data and the information that we have available there. Hydrologic alteration, this is something that we've worked on from the very beginning. This is another thing that's important to all species of wildlife. It's important to wetlands. Everything's going to need water. Flow and natural flow regimes is absolutely critical to the health of streams and to fish populations. This is a place where we've had some help from the LCCs. We've received some partial funding for our Southern In-Stream Flow Network from the South Atlantic LCC in 2010 through this year, and then the Gulf Coast Prairies, we're actually moving out there to work on that area in the coming couple of years. So again, a place where I think our needs meet, and certainly we have lots of things in common there. This is one of the products that's coming out for the South Atlantic, a flow alteration assessment. So we can actually look at areas where human activities are threats to natural flow regimes. We've identified some of those areas here, and now we're going to compare those to the priority areas that have been identified by state wildlife action plans, by joint ventures, and by other conservation organizations. A way that the LCCs are helping us to bring it all together and identify common priorities. This native black bass initiative, this is something that's near and dear to my heart. There's some really unique species of black bass that live in the rivers and streams of the Southeast. They tend to get overlooked because they're kind of in the no man's land. They're sport fish, but they're not widely known. They're maybe not widely pursued like some of the better well-known sport fish. So they miss out on the non-game funding, and they miss out on some of the sport fish funding as well. Some of these fish, we really don't know a lot about their life history. There are new species being described even today. So there's a lot of things, a lot of conservation work to be done with these fish, and there are a lot of commonalities with other species that the common threats that these fish face. Things like hybridization with introduced non-native species, or competition with those introduced species of non-natives, urbanization, habitat fragmentation, all of these things. So we feel like if we improve habitat for these fish, we're going to improve it for a lot of other fish species too. This is Guadalupe bass in the Gulf Coast Prairies LCC. This is their habitat, the Edwards Plateau, very unique region of Texas. Some beautiful aquatic resources, just an amazing place. These are spring-fed rivers, places that you really are. When I go there, I'm surprised that these places are in Texas because it really doesn't fit your typical view of Texas. But a beautiful, beautiful area. Guadalupe bass, the state fish of Texas. Up in the, I guess it's going to be your left-hand corner, you can see some realized distribution where these fish live now. We're improving habitats in those areas. We are eliminating some non-native smallmouth bass that were introduced there and actually compete with and hybridize with these fish. So we're working in those areas now. Potential distribution, there are some areas where we might still be able to move with these fish, where they're not found now. But here's the scary part. Under these climate change scenarios, there's not a lot of that habitat left. Not a lot of areas left there. So that raises a lot of questions. You know, do we walk away from the state fish of Texas because the climate change scenario says it may not have any habitat in 50 years? If one of these begins to happen, do we move this fish out of its native range and actually try to establish it in suitable habitat that's outside its native range? These are the kind of forward-thinking questions that I believe need to be answered at an LCC level, and you folks can help us begin to consider these questions before we're faced with having to take action, before we lose these species. This is a project that we did on the Tennessee Cumberland River in cooperation with a lot of other fish habitat partnerships across the Midwest, actually. But another great example, I think, of the types of work that we could use some assistance with. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, what types of assistance we could use. But I want you to be aware of this because we look at stress index, natural habitat quality, but a lot of the underlying data we have to make assumptions for because we really don't know what's there in those streams and in those rivers, or we don't have that type of data compiled on a regional basis. So habitat restoration, this is something that we do, that we receive funding for. This is something that all fish habitat partnerships receive some funding to put these projects on the ground to address the priorities that are identified by either LCCs or our state and federal partners or by the partnerships themselves. So those are some of the things that we work on, some of the things that we've already worked on with LCCs. How can we work together to improve both organizations? Well, as I mentioned, we receive funding for on-the-ground habitat restoration. So we're able to do that part of the conservation delivery. We don't receive really no dedicated funding for science capacity in the fish habitat partnerships. We're definitely, I guess you'd say, the poor cousin of these three partnerships, types of partnerships here. So you need to realize that we don't have the capacity for science. We've basically pieced it together out of our member agencies and where we can obtain grants and other types of donations to get some of that work done. We've definitely identified a lot of needs. So, you know, don't be bashful, you folks that work for the LCCs. Approach the fish habitat partnerships. You don't wait on them to come to you, because some of them may not have any money to travel. So go to them. Find out what you can do and how you can work together. Water consistently shows up as one of the most important conservation issues for the public. This is a perfect tie-in. So this is a great opportunity for us to get some public support for our programs, for all of these programs, to move them forward. Oh, the fish picture I just threw in there to keep it interesting. So I think it's time to take this collaboration to a new level. I'm going to, go out on a limb here. I think the LCCs, at least in our region, have been around for a couple years. Some of them have, and they've had time to become established. And I think it's time for us to better define the roles that each of the LCCs is going to take. What do we know that we can depend on LCCs to do, and what do we know that we need to focus our efforts and our resources on? So that's my message for the day, Mike. Hopefully that was close to 10 minutes, and thank you.
Thank you, Scott. And if folks are not familiar with the National Fish Habitat Action Plan or Partnership Program, you can look that up. I believe it's connected on our Fish and Wildlife Service website, but you can also do a search for it and go to it directly. So programs like the Western Native Trout Initiative or the Plains and Prairies Partnership or Desert Fish Partnership, there's others out there, and they're all doing great work, and another opportunity for us to leverage and align with at the LCC level. Next, we're going to hear from Raul Morales, who is the Deputy State Director for the Bureau of Land Management in Nevada. And he's going to talk to us about sage grouse, which is on everybody's mind in the West. And certainly a lot of collaborative opportunities there and some big challenges. And I'll let him introduce himself as well.
So we've heard a lot about sage grouse today, this morning, and I can tell you when I reported to Nevada a little over a year ago, it's been a constant diet of mine. I probably spent a good 60 to 70% of my week dealing with sage grouse, because not only in Nevada are we dealing with the greater sage grouse, but we're also dealing with the bi-state sage grouse, which is on a separate effort than the greater sage grouse, and I might add it's on a much more expedited effort to come up with hopefully a potential a non-listing decision by Fish and Wildlife Service, but basically a year and a half from now. So sage grouse is my life. A little background about me: I started off as a biologist in southern Idaho with the Bureau about 30 years ago. I kind of got the range-wildlife interaction figured out roughly after about 9 years and decided I wanted some other challenges. That was back in the early 90s. By then, the spotted owl issue in Oregon, California, and Washington was heating up. I decided I wanted to go over there and try that so I could get my wildlife and forestry experience underneath my belts. So I did get that experience before I got into supervisory management positions both in Eugene, Grand Junction, Colorado, and then from there I ended up in our Washington, D.C. office as our Deputy Division Chief for our Fish, Wildlife, and Plant Conservation Group, where I was there for 2 years and started to see this sage grouse issue really begin to bubble up while I was back there. And by the time I landed in Reno, like I said, over a year ago, it was basically the train was leaving the station and it was leaving fast. So this planning effort, when I look at it, it definitely truly is a landscape model, a landscape issue. It's going to involve challenges to the biological knowledge that we have, the political challenges that we will have, 10 western states. It's going to challenge the social context by which we think about conservation and also economics. We've been hearing a lot about jobs. We've been hearing a lot about trying to turn the economy around. And the Secretary Secretary Salazar has clearly said the priority for us is renewable energy and protection of our conservation resources. So it's dual-fold, and so that's a huge challenge when you're managing multiple use to try to manage for both of these when sometimes they are in conflict. I want to say that while the sage grouse train was moving, internally we were moving pretty quick. As you guys know, who work for federal and state governments, we frequently get criticized for moving very slowly, and now we're getting criticized for moving way too fast. So I think that's a good thing, really. But needless to say, the public has truly awakened, and I think they awakened around Christmas of last year because the Bureau issued 2 very important policies that I will talk about here shortly, and people began to see the writing on the wall, and people have become much more engaged. Director Abbey has told the BLM that this sage grouse issue is fundamentally going to change the way we manage our public lands, and I believe he is right. So a little background for everybody. Back in January 2005, Fish and Wildlife Service issued a 12-month not warranted finding. They were promptly sued. And in December 2007, the court remanded the decision back to Fish and Wildlife Service. In 2010, Fish and Wildlife Service came back and said warranted but precluded. It came back with a listing, the greater sage grouse, of 8, and just to put it in context, the bi-state came back as a 3. The bi-state is also known as the mono population, for those of you who remember that. And so basically, when they came back with that decision, basically they fired a shot across the bow of BLM and said, hey, BLM, the way you're managing your public lands currently is not the right way to do it. We know that if we do not make changes to the way we manage our public lands, the bird will get listed. So we do not want that to happen. Now, of course, Fish and Wildlife Service got sued on this decision too because a sage grouse, as well as about 250 other species, were put on their Canada species list. Some environmental organizations wanted the Fish and Wildlife Service to make a determination whether or not to list the bird. There's a court settlement, and for the greater sage grouse, Fish and Wildlife has September 2015 to make their final determination on whether or not to list the bird. I should say one thing that is kind of interesting in my career. When I first was a young pup working out of Idaho as a biologist, I remember listening to scientists back in the early 80s raising the concern that our sagebrush ecosystems were in trouble and that they were fearful of a listing of the sage grouse. So here we are 30 years later, and we're really getting down to business as far as making that determination. So Fish and Wildlife Service identified a few factors that BLM needed to address. They felt that we had inadequate regulatory mechanisms. That was one of the major factors that led to that warranted and precluded finding. For BLM, our principal regulatory mechanisms are our land use plans or our resource management plans. These plans are typically 20-year documents in life. We have a lot of instructional memos, or IMs as we call them. Fish and Wildlife Service are saying those are not adequate regulatory mechanisms, because theoretically these IMs are usually 1 or 2 year documents. That's what their longevity is supposed to be, and then we're supposed to either update our manuals or modify our plans. We tended to use our IMs a little longer than that, and of course those IMs could be waved by a wand and said they're no longer in effect at any time. So from Fish and Wildlife's perspective, they felt those IMs were inadequate as a regulatory mechanism. And one of the things, and when I talked to Pat Dybert, my good friend there with Fish and Wildlife Service, who's the Fish and Wildlife Service sage grouse coordinator, she jokingly tells me that we drive her crazy because we are, as an agency, very inconsistent on our approach on our policies on our landscape. So we needed to come up with a more consistent measure. So these are the threats that Fish and Wildlife Service looked at in 2005 when they were making the determination on whether or not to list the bird or not. They brought these threats forward in their 2007 determination. What I really want to highlight is those red arrows. Basically, from the top of the chart there to the bottom, list the order kind of importance, the severe threats. At the time in 2005, renewable energy was not really on the screen. Since then, obviously, renewable energy is big, and Fish and Wildlife Service has said renewable energy ranks right up there with the infrastructure and oil and gas, so it lumped it into energy development. So Fish and Wildlife Service considers invasive species, wildfires, like I said, oil and gas, infrastructure, some of the major threats to the bird, and I'll talk a little bit about that as far as where the best threats are. One of the issues that we're hearing a lot of from the public is predation and hunting. We hear that regularly in our scoping meetings. Some of them feel that that's the problem, and if you look at this chart, you'll see that hunting is way down there at the bottom, and predation is also very low. So while there may be local impacts from either maybe hunting or predation, from Fish and Wildlife's perspective, these are very low threats to the bird. And if we as an agency focused on those lower threats in our land use plan amendments and EISs, the bird's going to get listed. So there's about 100 million acres of greater sage-grouse habitat in the West, located in the 10 western states that you see there. The one state you don't see is Washington. They have a small population of greater sage-grouse. From BLM's perspective, we manage very, very, very little public land acres for that bird. So that's not why you've heard 11 states earlier today. It's not part of our planning effort. BLM controls about 50% of the bird's habitat across those 10 western states. As an agency, BLM manages 240 million acres. You would think that's a lot of acres and that we shouldn't be having so much conflict. But of that 240 million acres, 75 million acres of it is in Alaska. You take out about 25 million acres in Arizona and New Mexico where we do not have sage-grouse. That leaves 47 million acres in those remaining 10 states that BLM has the responsibility for management of with sage-grouse. That represents 40% of our landscape in those states. That's huge, that's significant. So part of our planning effort is going to involve 68 planning units. And since we started that process with the train left last summer, the Forest Service has joined in and is now also involved in our planning effort. And there's 20 forest plans that are also going to be analyzed, and the public will be providing scoping comments. And Forest Service manages 8% of the bird's population across the West. There's a lot of similarities of stakeholders between BLM and Forest Service, and we felt that was very important, and the Forest Service also agreed that we needed to kind of coordinate our planning efforts again to ensure consistency, talk with one voice to our stakeholders, so they knew what was going on regardless if they were on BLM or Forest Service lands. This is the general distribution of sage-grouse across the West. It involves 4 LCCs. It involves the Great Northern, Southern Rockies, the Great Basin, and the Plains and the Prairie potholes. That threats chart that I had up a few slides ago, BLM decided to divide these states into basically 2 regions, the Rocky Mountain region and the Great Basin region. The reason why for the division is the threats are different. In the Rocky Mountain region, the predominant threat is oil and gas developments, and in the Great Basin region, it's fire and invasive species. Now, when I say that, and when I say that to the public, they immediately focus on those 2 top threats and think everything else is not very big at all. I need to reiterate, those are just the top 2 threats. There are many other threats. You saw that on the slide. Energy development is very big, whether it's gold mines, whether it's geothermal, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's transmission, whether it's windmills, all very big. Each state is in the process of taking this larger landscape map and truly identifying what we're calling in our planning effort preliminary priority habitats and preliminary general habitats. Those are the 2 classifications that we are trying to get public comments on as we move forward on our plans. We're asking for validation of those areas because eventually we will have, at the end of our planning effort, priority sage-grouse habitat and priority general habitats across the landscape by which we will manage for sage-grouse. Our perspective is that if the birds get listed, they become an endangered species, it'll affect those 47 million acres I was talking about, not to mention impacts on private ground. Some people say, why don't you just list a bird and be done with it? Our feeling is that better to be proactive, better to structure where those important priority areas are for sage-grouse. And if we can do a lot of that on the public lands, whether it's Forest Service or BLM, and not involve so much private grounds unless private landowners want to, and there are willing landowners who want to do it, particularly in the bi-states, that we should be able to take care of the bird. If we let this bird get listed, then it's going to slow up processes for projects. We'll have to go through consultation. It'll be costly. There'll be uncertainty. The litigation opportunities will be just that much greater. We will get sued. There's no doubt about it. We will get sued from this effort. I hope that we have learned a lot from the Northern Spotted Owl efforts. We can apply some of those learning skills, those learning opportunities to the greater sage-grouse and put ourselves in the best position so that when we get sued, we're going to come out on the better end of that suit. But our goal is be proactive, identify those priority areas for the bird and the habitats, and our stakeholders are all on board with that. So our BLM, our Greater Sage-Grouse Planning effort basically was to, I mentioned, revise our land use plans, those 68 plans that I told you across the West. The goal is to conserve and restore greater sage-grouse habitats, ensure the conservation measures are carried forward. One of our efforts included a national technical team report, which gathered the scientists from USGS, NRCS, state fish and game agencies, BLM program managers. There's someone else I'm missing, but Fish and Wildlife Service, of course. And we took the best science out there and interpreted that science and developed conservation measures that could be supported by science or supported by professional judgment by the science. That technical team report is one of the alternatives that we will be looking at in our planning efforts as we move forward. I can envision where some of those conservation measures, that technical team report will be pulled out as we form other alternatives. But I think at the end of the day, we need to have a strong science background underpinning for whatever our preferred alternative is as we move forward. Like I said, also Forest Service is now cooperating with us on our sage-grouse planning effort. I think that's great. I mentioned December was when people started to wake up. What happened there is that BLM issued 2 instructional memorandums. One that was geared to how we are going to plan, how we're going to modify our land use plans across the West, how we were going to use that national technical team report. Again, it's going to be one of the alternatives that we will be looking at. The other one established, and this is the one that's getting a lot of comments, I guess I could say, strong comments, is our interim policy. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. One of the governing structures, or I should say the governing structure that we struck up was that in order to move all of us together forward, we have what we call a national policy team. This national policy team is composed of 2 state directors, the Nevada and the Wyoming state director, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, NRCS, I do believe, is getting involved, and our folks back in our Washington office. Their goal is to make sure that what we're doing at the ground level is consistent. If there are issues that come out from the ground, from the regional efforts, they will be the final sayer as far as resolving some of those conflicts. They've also been setting the direction by which we will go forward with our planning efforts, so they're giving direction down to that lower level. Also mentioned the National Technical Team, which was that science approach that came up with that report. We also have regional management teams focusing on the Great Basin and the Rocky, and again, their goal is to address the threats predominantly in those areas. And then what I call the doers, the sub-regional teams. They're the ones at the ground level who are actually putting the plans together, developing the alternatives. They'll take that national technical team report and the conservation measures in there, modify them if necessary at that ground level to fit that ground level need while still holding true to the intent of that national technical team report. If there are issues that where they are conflicting, those issues will get raised up to the regional management team, and if they can't be resolved there, up to that national policy team. The makeup of these teams includes Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, NRCS. So we have a lot of involvements. There's a lot of skin in this game for sure. So just to break up, just to show you the map here, the states in the red of the Rocky Mountain region, it's of Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and eastern Utah. And again, the major threat there, oil and gas development. States in the blue are Idaho, Oregon, a little bit of Montana, a little bit of California, Nevada, and western Utah. And again, we're looking at invasive species and fire as a major threat that we need to address. So this is how we kind of broke the landscape down and where the 4 LCCs fit in. Here's the timeline that we're marching under. Basically, the public scoping portion we just completed here March 23rd. I know we're getting a lot of comments in. We've got a contractor that is going to be going through those comments and kind of sorting them out for us as we start developing the alternatives. Basically hoping a year from now to have a draft plan out and then a final plan completed by September 2014. This will give Fish and Wildlife Service 1 year to go through their process and making that determination of whether to list or not to list. We have been encouraging Fish and Wildlife Service every step of the way that if BLM or Forest Service is bringing them the wrong rock, raise their hand and say it soon. We don't want to get to the draft, or we don't want to get to that final stage to have a uh-oh moment. So Fish and Wildlife Service, I think, has got that message and has been very involved with what we're doing. So the first item I mentioned was just kind of the land use planning efforts. You know, again, it was just basically saying, here's the plans that need to be amended. Here's the conservation measures you need to look at as far as your alternatives. I think I'm getting ready to get the hook here. Stakeholder involvement, of course, has been critical. Each state is now looking at doing things differently. Looking at the Wyoming model, there's a few states, Idaho, Nevada, Utah, trying to do what I call a quick Wyoming model, where Wyoming took 3 years to come up with their plan, their Wyoming's core plan. Other states are trying to do it in 90 and 120 days. BLM is going to use those state-developed plans as one of the alternatives that we will evaluate as we move forward. Again, more planning. I'm just moving forward. I'm trying to cruise here. Interim direction, like I said, this is the one that's definitely getting a lot of discussion right now. The Forest Service is in the process of basically taking BLM's interim plan and fixing it and modifying it to fit their needs, their verbiage, their processes. We expect that to come out very soon. Again, the focus of the interim management plan is to preserve our options during the next 2 years. We don't want to be doing things negatively on the habitat of the bird where Fish and Wildlife Service will tell us game over because of what we did during this interim period. That has got the stakeholders very concerned because even though we can still do things in sage-grouse habitat, it is very restricted. We do have to pass the test. If this project is going to be negatively impacted to the bird or its habitat, chances are it's not going to go through. So that's got people concerned during the next 2 years. And basically all of our programs are affected by this interim policy. Those are just a few of them up there. So finally, you know, 2 years, very ambitious. The BLM has never done business like this before. I think Forest Service is in the same boat, and Fish and Wildlife Service and their involvement in this process, also new for them. The key to this is the multiple interagency involvement. State Fish and Game agencies, NRCS has been playing a huge role with private landowners and done wonderful things. There's a lot that we can learn from them in this efforts. USGS, again, has provided some wonderful science. So we got great efforts. We got a lot of people with the trust is high and moving forward. Nobody wants to list the bird. And so, but the message I'm leaving for folks is if people think this is challenging, the planning part, this is really the easy part. The hard part is going to be when we actually have to implement the plan, because there are folks out there that are watching and they're waiting for us to trip up, and you know they will bring the bird back up for a listing if we don't do what we said we're going to do.
Okay, we're running just a few minutes behind. We started a little behind, but we're going to go ahead and take questions into the individual breakout sessions. So hopefully you know from your program where to go for which these you'd like to join. One will be on the U.S. Forest Service Collaborative Forest Land Restoration Program. The other will be on NIFHAP and joint venture together. And then